Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, January 25th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Greg Sukiennik, who writes for the Bennington Banner, the Manchester Journal, and the Brattleboro Reformer. He's been covering the Statehouse remotely up in Montpelier for the last several months, and is here today to kind of bring us up to speed on what may be going on up north in a remote
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be back.
Great, good to have you back, Greg. It's been far too long, so
It has.
good to have you with us, and the timing is perfect with the legislature just getting started. The governor going to be giving his budget address tomorrow, the 26th. Lots of stuff going on, but I thought we might start by just talking a little bit about one bill that I believe passed through the legislature last week, or maybe it was in the week before, when went through like greased lightning, which they were all saying they had to do. And that's the bill that refers to the changes to town meeting. As we all know, town meeting is going to look a lot different this year because of the COVID pandemic. What is in that bill or piece of legislation now?
It was a fairly simple and straightforward piece of legislation, but saying that, it's still, there was a real art to that. The legislature, actually the committees on government operations started working on that before the legislature even took, the new legislature took office, because they knew that in order for town and city clerks to get ballots out, if they were going to vote by mail, that had to be, time was of the essence. So what the bill does is it allows cities and towns or municipal boards to hold their town meeting to send ballots by mail. It also allows them to move the date of town meeting if they so choose. So Winhall, for example, appears to be taking that tack. Governor Scott had actually asked that voting by mail be mandatory, but the legislature did say that they felt that giving towns flexibility was really important. The phrase "one size doesn't fit all" was heard a number of times, and this really did get fast tracked. It went from I think it was less than 2 weeks from when the opening gavel fell to signature by the governor, which is that's a land speed record for the Vermont legislature.
It's almost unprecedented, I think.
Well, I mean, it wasn't super controversial, and the governor had indicated that, look, I want this mandatory vote by mail thing to happen, but if it doesn't, it's not going to kill the bill. I'll still sign it and move it along. So here we are. And so we might see some towns go completely Australian ballot. We might see, I believe Winhall has moved their town meeting to April, if memory serves. So, we might see, so that might have some effect on how budgets are passed and whether, depending on financial conditions as we move forward.
Going to be interesting to see how those online information meetings work out because typically they occur the night before the voting or the day before, right, if a town separates the traditional floor meeting format into the two parts. So it's going to be interesting to see if the towns schedule them all at the same time on Monday night, or if they spread them out a week or so before. And then if you do that, how much back and forth happens in the week before, in between the info meeting and the actual voting?
It's an interesting question. And also it speaks to the amount of online access that people have. Broadband access is a big consideration for both houses of the legislature and the governor this year. And certainly we can have online informational hearings, but if folks aren't really internet savvy or don't have broadband access, then that limits their participation in government. And so that's a consideration that some towns are going to have to consider as they move forward.
Yeah.
Also, you have to bring your own cookies to these things. There won't be. There's not a situation where snacks are provided for attendees. You'll have to bake your own.
And the obligatory person who is knitting a sweater won't be present either, or maybe
you'll have to work the rows away in your easy chair as you watch, which actually maybe is more comfortable. It might increase access in some regard. People can't make the drive up to wherever the town meeting is. They can sit in the comfort of their own home.
A lot more opportunity to tune in. But anyway, that's one thing the legislature did get done, but there's a whole bunch of other things. Of course, a lot of it a lot of the conversation I heard before the legislature reconvened earlier in this month was the focus was going to be largely around COVID and COVID recovery. And just to that point, it seems like the tax receipts and revenue projections that were being discussed last year came in a lot better than expected. You have a big story in today's Banner, I think touches on that apparently, I guess in large part due to the federal money that the state received.
Right.
The financial picture the state is facing right now is a lot better than they were fearing 8 or 9 months ago.
Right. Well, better is always in quotes. As we know, economics is the dismal science. I found this interesting because it really does influence the way the legislature and the governor decide to allocate for the budget, and also the way that they're planning for the future. Yes, the tax receipts so far for the first 6 months of fiscal 2021, the fiscal year we're in, are well ahead of the somewhat dire projections that were that the state had put forward in August, almost reaching the original projections, as a matter of fact. So the issue is that now the belief is that federal spending did in fact do what John Maynard Keynes, and that's that school of economics said it would do, which is inject money into the economy to prevent recession from getting worse. And so the thought is that, especially in the area of purchases, that people were able to take the money that they got from expanded unemployment and from the stimulus checks, as limited as they were compared to some other nations, that money did in fact recirculate through the economy. And it's a fortunate thing that the state did decide to take advantage of the Wayfair decision and collect sales taxes on online purchases, because a lot of those purchases that where the revenues flowing in were from online. The issue is that as the state's budgeting and trying to figure out what's going to happen in the next couple of years and what kinds of long-term commitments it can make, first of all, the federal government might be more generous with the change of administration, but that train isn't going to run forever. And at some point, the state's going to have to stand on its own revenues again. And how difficult that might be is an open question, especially when you have a K-shaped recovery where some sectors are doing well and some sectors, hospitality in particular, are still doing poorly or struggling. That's it's a little wonky, but at the same time, the amount of money the state has very much influences what kinds of programs the state might, the legislature might want to put in place, the kinds of investment that the state wants to make, for example, in childcare, in broadband, so it's fun with numbers, but at the same time, it really does govern policy that affects everybody.
Oh, sure. If you're looking at a budget deficit that's in the 20 million range, which I believe is one of the last numbers I saw, compared to 80 or 90 or 100, then you're thinking maybe about things like childcare or the state colleges or broadband.
Yes. All needs, or the pension.
Different. Maybe we can peel off something. And to that point, one other thing I guess that's bubbling up there is this whole question around are we finally going to do something about the state pension deficit? Well,
when you consider how much money is being poured into our catch-up payments, and unlike a fixed year mortgage, it's more like an ARM where the amount of money is actually increasing because the pension liability keeps growing. So every one of those dollars is a dollar that the state can't spend on something else that it wants to do. For example, a housing bond, or childcare access, or brain just stopped there for a moment. For a number of programs, things that the state wants to do to make Vermonters' lives better. As long as it has to keep shoveling money into the coal fire furnace that is this pension obligation, those are dollars that it can't spend on something else. Now, how do you fix that that's the multi-billion-dollar question, and the early returns on limiting cost of living adjustments for future retirees that was fairly negative, as one might expect. But that's a tough question, and the unions, on their part, were talking about, well, maybe we should increase taxes we should have a more progressive tax, kind of like the Snelling tax, where folks who benefited from the Trump tax cuts are asked to pay more. Whether that's something that Governor Scott wants to do is an open question. Probably not. Would the legislature be willing to do that? They're still very cognizant of the fact that we're in recovering from a pandemic, and tax hikes are not going to be popular. In fact, they're going to be very difficult. So it's a tough question. But if the state wants to get out of this quandary of having to shovel millions of dollars every year into trying to catch up with its unfunded liability, then it simply has to be addressed one way or another. And that's, I think, perhaps the COLA adjustment might have been a test balloon to see, okay, well, here's the worst case scenario, and let's see if when people react to it, then we can go to other plans and say, well, if we can't do this, then we need to do that. So it's we're at the opening stages of that process, and I do think that given the seriousness of this, that there'll be a real impetus to act.
One of the other things that I guess has sparked a certain amount of, I won't say controversy, but at least discussion, shall we say,
okay,
in Montpelier is the proposal to, well, I guess it's an executive order that Governor Scott issued, I believe it was last week, on Act 250 and overhauling that. I mean, that's been a piece of legislation that's been bouncing around in the State House for the past couple of years. They never seem to kind of get to coming up with a comprehensive overhaul of a now 50-year-old piece of legislation. But the governor came up with a proposal to, I guess you could say, centralize the administration of Act 250 claims and kind of drive more of those proposals into a state panel at the Natural Resources Board, which at first glance would seem to have diluted or diminished the role that the local commission boards would play. I guess this has also gotten caught up in a bit of constitutional well, concern.
The constitutional law exercise.
Yeah. Do that, or do both houses of the State House have to approve it, or can it just be one? That'll be kind of fun to follow how that goes, I guess. But getting back to the main point here, do you think this is an idea that's gonna gain some traction up there? I mean, it sounded like every legislator I've talked to about Act 250 has always been frustrated about how, oh my God, we really need to overhaul it because times are different from 1970. But when push comes to shove, they can't seem to find a consensus around it. Is this in the right direction?
It's and we also have to consider that this is something that's being talked about on Zoom rather than in person, and these more complicated issues become a little more difficult to wrangle when people aren't able to talk face to face. The legislature, the House had a pretty comprehensive Act 250 bill that had gotten over to the Senate right before COVID hit, and so that was. It passed. It passed the House, but it was essentially what the decision was. Well, let's put it on the back burner, and then let's winnow it down to a couple of issues where we can start moving forward. And that passed with a little less enthusiasm and was vetoed by the governor, as a matter of fact. So these executive orders, Governor Scott says, touch on some of the concepts that have been discussed in Act 250 reform, and that's. Update rather than reform, let's say. And that's trying to come up with they're seeing a need for a more professional approach to it with a professionally appointed board rather than relying upon the district commissions. The testimony on that was pretty interesting because you really do. Act 250 is one of these things where everyone has an opinion, and there's. In trying to find where the consensus is between folks who say, well, this is exactly the way it should be and it should stay exactly the way it is, and folks who say this thing needs to be completely overhauled and maybe chucked out to the dustbin. There's a lot of room in the middle for there. Now, as to the constitutional question, it's interesting because the U.S. Supreme Court decision that the Governor's Council referred to as saying that you need disapproval from two houses, not one. That decision was handed down in 1983. So this isn't exactly new news. And it's interesting that a potential challenge to that would be made through an executive order rather than a bill that actually corrects the statute, if in fact it's been sitting there in some form of violation of the Constitution for 38 years. So it's the other thing that's interesting about this is that we do have a lawmaker from our district here in the North Shire, Seth Bongartz, who, as a practicing attorney and as president of Hildene, has been on both sides of this. Right. So I think he's still very much, it seems from talking to him, is in the listening stages and trying to figure out where to go. But he does have the perspective of having been on both sides of an Act 250 permit application. So it's so it'll be interesting, and he's a member of the Natural Resources Committee. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of influence his experience might have on what comes out of that committee. The amount of ways that Act 250 touches everyday life in development, housing. There's pieces of economic recovery that the state wants to do to try to get people to work and try to also deal with climate change in terms of having more concentrated development in village centers. Well, in order for that to happen, there's a desire to streamline the process. But whether this is the right way to streamline that seems like that's, it's kind of like the little kid with a chocolate bar. It gets everywhere. So it'll be an interesting debate. And I think I don't want to bet on what's going to happen, because when you see how Act 250 goes, when everyone has an opinion, it's a lot harder to come to consensus.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because, as you say, this bill it encompasses so much territory, and there's so much to it.
But we'll know soon, because this has to be handled before April. The legislature has 90 days to figure this out.
Okay.
And so if otherwise the order takes effect. If they don't they can vote to approve or disapprove. They can't amend it. So it's up or down. So perhaps we'll come to a point where they say, well, no, but maybe if you send us something like this, or maybe they'll sign off.
Certainly one worth watching.
For sure.
To move on here, I wanted to ask you what you thought the outlook was for the sort of proposed gun bill that's come up before the legislature, which one of our local state senators, Richard Sears, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee, will be playing an important role in. That committee's been hearing some testimony on a bill that would ban guns in hospitals, child care facilities, and publicly owned buildings. I guess last report, I guess it needs 3 votes in that committee, and they've got 2, and Senator Sears is not one of the 2, but it sounds like he's sitting on the fence on this one at this point. What do you think? Is this a bill? A couple of years ago, it was a very controversial gun bill that came up before the House, and of course, one of the signature moments of Governor Scott's administration is when he signed that bill out in the steps of the Statehouse. I think back in 2018. So this is one that's going to touch the nerve endings of a lot of folks. You think it's got a chance of passage? Well,
from only one session of testimony, it's hard to tell. Because I do think that, I think as chair of the Judiciary Committee, I think Senator Sears is kind of, he's giving all this due consideration. The first session of testimony, there was a lot of government officials who were talking about government buildings and about, their feelings about employee safety. Also, the sponsor of the bill, Senator Philip Baruth of the Progressive from Burlington, was talking about, and he's put forward a number of gun bills actually, but this is the first one that actually got to committee, and it does have a number. It has to have 16 one sponsor and 15. Wait, no, I'm actually confusing that with another bill. Excuse me. It's got a number of sponsors, which does indicate some support. That being, so he was talking about, just from watching the last couple of years and watching what happened at the insurrection in Washington on January 6th, about and what happened in Michigan, for example, about sort of the level of threat and the temperature of rhetoric, and why he felt that this was a common sense bill that addresses that addresses safety and addresses people, being able to feel secure, and about government buildings not being a place where debate is, with ideas and words, and not with, intimidation, from his perspective. Now, we did start to hear from some folks on the Second Amendment side of the issue. There's actually Chris Bradley of the, I forget the exact name. It's the Association of Sporting Clubs, Sportsmen's Clubs in Vermont. I've mangled their name. My apologies to them. He will be testifying first when they speak again on this. I believe that happens Tuesday or Wednesday. So there's going to be a lot more to this bill in the way of testimony, and so I think it's going to. There's a lot of opportunity for folks to sway members of the committee and get across where the priority should be. From Senator Baruth's perspective, it's like this seems like this is common sense. In fact, there's signs at Southwest Vermont Medical Center and at the Statehouse that say no guns, but essentially that equates to there's no law backing that up. So essentially it's
you to be
right. Please put your gun away, or please, please leave. And the most that comes out of that is a civil infraction. And it was interesting that a couple of folks did say, well, look, we already have laws in the books that could be applied to this. Do we need another specific law? So one of those folks was the Defender General of Vermont, Matt Valerio. So that's an interesting argument that perhaps will, that's an interesting discussion point that perhaps will get more attention from the committee as well.
One other thing we'd be remiss not to mention, at least for a minute or two, is the fact that today, Monday the 25th of January, is the day when registrations start for COVID vaccinations for people who aren't first responders, healthcare workers. If you're 75 or older, you can start to sign up on the Department of Health's website, I believe, is where you'd go, or there's a phone number. So what have you been hearing about that? Elsewhere around the country, it seems like we have at best a very mixed record of getting vaccines.
That's a kind way to say it.
Sounds like it's been a very disjointed kind of process with a few exceptions. Do you think the plan that the state has put in place, working our way down through age brackets from 75 to 70 to 65, and hopefully by springtime, everyone 65 and older is vaccinated, is that going to be a logistical?
Theoretically, yes. It's interesting when you watch the Scott administration, when they put a proposal forward, they sort of talk about it sort of generally for a couple of weeks and then come forward with the specifics. It's like they like to prepare people for what they're going to do and then say, okay, here it is. In this case, they've been talking about the necessity of getting to older Vermonters first, because they've been, because older Vermonters have been, unfortunately, the lion's share of folks who've died from COVID-19. And they say that there's a moral obligation for us to get to these people first. Plus, once we've got that section, done and accounted for, that makes it easier for us to double back. A lot depends on, I think some of it depends upon whether the website and the phone system are going to work practically, whether the appointment system is going to work practically. But it really seems like the most of it depends upon, from the state health department and from Mike Smith at the Agency of Human Services perspective, it really depends upon supply. Do we have enough vaccine? And are we going to be able to actually get it into people's arms? Secretary Smith has said, look, we have this system in place and we can ramp this up if we need to. But we need the supply. So, we'll know a lot more, by the time this airs, we'll know a lot more about whether the website worked and whether the phone bank was overrun. They had 400 folks set to take phone calls, but if anyone experienced an unemployment claim at the height of the pandemic in March and April, they know how even a well-staffed phone bank can be overrun by demand. So it's a bit of a cop-out to say, well, we'll see, but in this case, it really is, well, we'll see.
That reminds me that one of the issues the Labor Department was facing back then, where it was their 30-year-old computer system, was running on COBOL or some software from the 1980s. which I sort of half remember semi-unfondly. And I trust that the Department of Health has a somewhat more modern piece of computer infrastructure ready for this. We'll find out.
For their sake, I certainly hope so. I think that the two systems that were the biggest in terms of overhauling computer systems, if memory serves, the Department of Labor and Health and Human Services were the really big challenges. I don't know if Health and Human Services is still running off of a mainframe that reads COBOL, as the Labor Department's server system does. That's a lot more. That issue is a lot more complicated than it seems when you think, well, why can't we just plug and play a new system? Well, why does this have to be so expensive? There's a lot of federal requirements. There's mandates that state departments of labor pair up with each other to try to lower cost. And did that really work? And then, what if you don't have a dance partner? And Vermont was talking to the Dakotas about whether it could. So I don't know if to the extent that the Health and Human Services system is ready for this or not. But we are talking about banding does allow them to pay attention to a finite number of people. So between 65 and up, we're talking about 125,000 Vermonters. So that's at least that way there's a more limited audience, and it's not everybody all at once trying to apply or everyone at once trying to call. We'll
find out.
We'll find out. It's that's in terms of Vermont's hailed right. Vermont is ahead on vaccinations, as it has been ahead on a number of areas during this pandemic. But this is one of those really important ones, and so it's and a lot of people are going to be paying attention, especially as they're anxious about getting a vaccine dose.
Fingers crossed, I guess. Well, we have about a minute left. I was just wanted to quickly ask you, what's it been like covering the State House remotely? I mean, and in one sense, it's probably easier. I mean, you don't have to drive to Montpelier all the time or whatever. But how's that been going, just doing it all by Zoom?
Well, the pluses and minuses are there. The pluses are not having to spend 4 hours of windshield time to go to a hearing, and being able to watch a hearing. For example, if I can't catch up with Ways and Means when they meet on a Tuesday, I can always double back and watch the video over. So that's for journalists such as us and for the general public, that's a big benefit. The negative, of course, is being able to sort of there's something about person-to-person contact and about building relationships that's missing from this, and so it's a lot more phone calls, and Zoom meetings, if you sit through enough of them during a day, do get physically exhausting, which sounds kind of lame. Wow, you sat in a chair and watched TV. How hard could that be? But it is sort of there's a lot of the reporting process. Mentally it's a bit of a challenge after a while. But I will say that having had a chance to see the State House up close and in person on the 7th, so that was a nice little birthday present. It was, you get a sense of why the place is special and why people want to be there. Just the history is just everywhere you turn in that building and that complex. And you sort of get a sense of what makes Vermont special as a small state where participation and democracy is part of the civic fabric and not just a spectator sport for folks who are interested in having political power.
And one of my hopes is that when this is all done, we can get back to that open State House. One of the charms of the State House to me always, you just could walk right in. Very little security. I just hope that that's going to survive. Well, we'll see. We're going to have to leave it there, Greg, for today. But I wanted to thank you for taking the time to be with us and share some of your thinking about what's in play up in the state capitol. And well, I think before they close up shop later in May or June or whenever, we'll have to have you come back and bring us up to speed again.
I look forward to that.